Hello, my name is Danny Greaves, and in this video I'd like to share with you the real impact of trauma. And this is the impact of trauma on your brain. Now, most of us are aware of how trauma impacts day-to-day life, so how it affects our sensations in the body, how it affects our relationships, how it affects our ability to actually communicate in the way that we want to. But often we don't look at the impact of trauma on the brain and actually the short-term and long-term consequences that leaving trauma unresolved can actually have on us. So in this video, we're going to talk through the main areas of the brain that are affected, what they do, and how that might manifest as a result of trauma. So the first part of the brain we're going to be talking about is called the default mode network. Now, the default mode network is really important for helping you to process what feelings you're having inside your body. So it helps you to identify information in your body that's relevant to you, and it also helps you to process these feelings. The default mode network is also really important for future planning, for getting a clear idea about where you want to go and how you want to get there. So we know that when someone is struggling with previous trauma, future planning can be difficult, interpreting body signals can be difficult, and this is because of the default mode network. The next part that we're going to talk about is called the Salience Network. Now, the Salience Network is really important because it helps you assess your environment for what is the most important bits of information. It helps you identify what you need to pay attention to if there's a real threat, and also what information in your environment is just benign and sort of not really important in any way. So very often people who have struggled with trauma in specific contexts or specific places, whenever they go around that type of environment again, all of a sudden the environment just feels really, really threatening and really, really overwhelming. And this is because trauma impacts the salience network, which makes it harder for you to differentiate what information in your environment is important and what's not. And when we're not able to differentiate that, we feel threatened, we feel worried, we feel scared, and that causes us to make maybe decisions that we wouldn't normally do. A problem with difficulties in the salience network is also it means we're more likely to misinterpret the body language or body intonations of other people. So whereas we might actually start to get a bit suspicious that they're having a certain intention for us or they're trying to do something to us, this might be the salience network being disrupted, and actually they're just doing their normal things and we're misinterpreting the environment. So salience network is really important. The next one that we have is called the central executive network. Now, the central executive network is the part of the brain that helps you to focus. It helps you to really engage in long periods, and it helps you to concentrate on things. So we need the central executive network to be productive at work, to be productive at home, to do the things that we like to do, and also to do them in an efficient way. So the central executive network is really important for that engaged, concentrated focus. So when we don't have that, we can feel blurry, we can feel unproductive, we can get stuck in procrastination, and it's because that area of the brain has been impacted by trauma and so isn't working as optimally as it could be. The next part of the brain we're going to talk about is called the hippocampus. Now, the hippocampus is a crucial part of the brain that's involved in both learning and memory. So there's lots of research and some famous books that gives us the insights that a stressed brain doesn't learn. And part of that is because when we're under significant stress, the hippocampus finds it really difficult to process any new learning, which means we struggle to take on board new information. The hippocampus is also really important for memory, so it helps us to store pieces of information, to store data. So very often, if someone has experienced traumatic or painful events, they'll probably have a difficulty in their short-term memory. So maybe they're forgetful, maybe they forget to retain information, or struggle to really take it on board. And this is when the hippocampus has been affected by previous trauma. The hippocampus also helps us to integrate memories. So when we have a trauma, what happens is cortisol is released, and over time the hippocampus actually shrinks, so it gets inhibited and it gets shrinks, which means there's actually less availability to process and integrate memories, which means those painful ones tend to come up to the surface even more often. So the hippocampus is really quite significantly affected when we have trauma. The next part of the brain that's also influenced is called the corpus callosum. Now, this is a part of the brain that connects the two hemispheres, so it connects the left and the right parts of the brain. Now, in our early years in particular, the corpus callosum helps integrate these two parts so that there's a smooth flow of information. Whereas when we have pain or trauma or difficult events when we're younger, in particular, this sort of cross-network communication can get disrupted, and so there's less integration from the left and the right parts of the brain. The next part of the brain that we're going to talk about is a really important and a really well-known one, known as the amygdala. So the amygdala is responsible for initiating the fight or flight response, and it's also involved in the pleasure response. So when you are feeling low, when you're feeling unfulfilled and you think, oh, I'll reach for that tub of ice cream, or I'll go shopping, or I'll go have a bottle of wine, then that's the amygdala that's sort of prompting you to get something immediately satisfying rather than being able to wait for sort of something long-term that's more fulfilling. So not only does the amygdala initiate the stress response, so those unpleasant sensations, but is also the part that drives the need to get immediate satisfaction, which can often compromise our long-term goals and our long-term plans, especially if we can't plan that effectively. So the amygdala is a really key part of the brain that's affected during trauma. There's one other part of the brain that I'd like to talk about, and this is called the dorsal prefrontal cortex. And this contains the part of the brain that's all about controlling the sense of timing. So helping you to know when one event starts and then when one event ends. So it gives you an impact of the time of certain events and the end of certain events. So this part of the brain can actually be impacted by trauma so that actually we lose a sense of timing, which sometimes means that those painful or traumatic events can seem like they go on forever. There's no end in sight. And when there's no end in sight, then it can become unbearable because you don't get an understanding that these feelings are going to come to an end. So we can see that the impact of trauma is really widespread and it affects lots of key parts of the brain that will influence your day-to-day productivity, your efficiency, and your ability to go for your goals over the long term. And this gives us a really idea about some of the hidden effects of trauma that we don't often see. Okay, thank you very much.